Well, it is great. We are on top of the hour now. I think we'll still have a few more people trickling in over the next few minutes, but we can go ahead and get started. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in this series, Scientific Publishing for Field Epidemiologists, brought to you by TEPHINET and WPSAR, the Western Pacific Surveillance and Response Journal. We're conducting this webinar series to celebrate the first annual World Field Epidemiology Day, which was last week on September 7th. World Field Epi Day was created as a global movement to recognize and raise awareness of the vital role of field epidemiologists in protecting the health of populations. Our goal in this series is to inform and encourage field epidemiologists to publish their work in peer-reviewed journals and perhaps become a peer reviewer as well. So this will be especially helpful for those with little to no publishing experience. But even if you do have a few publications under your belt, we hope that you can still learn a few things and benefit and gain some insight from the perspective of a journal editor. So I'm going to try and keep this to 30 minutes. Today's webinar is preparing your manuscript for submission. We're going to pick up right where we left off last week, where we talked about identifying your target journal, following the instructions to authors, and how to structure each section of your manuscript. Now I'm going to discuss what other information and documents you will likely need to prepare so that your manuscript is ready to go and the journal editors have everything they need to evaluate it. So for those of you who couldn't join us last week, I'd like to just briefly reintroduce the presenters for this webinar series. My name is Ashley Arashiro, and I am one of the coordinating editors for WPSAR. I manage the peer review and technical editing processes, and I monitor the progress of manuscripts from submission through to publication. My background is in technical writing and public health, and I've spent the last 7 years editing manuscripts in the health sciences and helping authors in the Western Pacific region submit their papers to international journals. Next, we have Michelle McPherson, who is my co-editor at WPSAR. She is a graduate and previous staff member of the Australian Field Epidemiology training program. She's worked with many FETPs in the Western Pacific region in her role with WPSAR and has attended TEPHINET conferences as a participant and as a workshop facilitator. As editor of WPSAR, Michelle works with authors to improve their manuscripts from pre-submission through acceptance for publication. And finally, we have Elena Atkinson, who is a project coordinator with TEPHINET, supporting knowledge exchange, community learning, scientific communication, and conference activities. She is especially passionate about implementing international efforts dedicated to empowering and training early career researchers on how to write and successfully publish their academic articles. Michelle and Elena will be answering questions in the chat today. So if you have a question during the presentation, go ahead and type it into the Q&A or in the chat, and they'll answer you as we go. And at the end, if we have any questions left over, I'll jump in and answer some live. And with that, let's get started. So you've finished writing your manuscript. What's next? Well, unfortunately, submitting a manuscript isn't as easy as just going to the journal website and pressing send. There are several other components that you'll need to include together with your manuscript. Each journal is going to have slightly different requirements. If you read the instructions to authors, you can get a good idea of what's expected. But sometimes once you actually log into the journal submission portal, you'll find that you need to enter extra information that the instructions didn't mention. So it's good to be familiar with the kinds of things that journals generally ask for so you can be prepared. Here, we're going to cover the most frequent components of a manuscript submission: an abstract, a title page, authorship information, acknowledgements and funding statements, conflict of interest declarations, a cover letter, and a copyright statement or form. We're going to go over each of these one by one. First is the abstract. In many ways, this can be the most important part of your manuscript. We journal editors use the abstract to screen your manuscript to get an idea of whether it fits the journal's scope and whether it'd be interesting to our readers. Peer reviewers will use the abstract to decide whether they want to review your manuscript. Many journals, including WPSAR, use a system where we send out requests for peer review that include only the title and the abstract. And if the reviewer agrees to do the review, then they get to see the whole paper. Finally, once a manuscript is published, readers will use the abstract to decide if they want to read the entire article. If the journal isn't open access, this can mean paying a fee to access the article on the journal's website, or if the reader's a student, they can sign into their university's online library to read articles for free. But either way, the abstract should act as an invitation for the reader to read more. Therefore, your abstract should be well written and interesting, should be a concise summary of your paper, should accurately reflect your paper, and must only include information that is mentioned in your paper. That being said, an abstract is actually not always required. It depends on your article type. You will definitely need one if you're submitting an original research article or any article type that tends to have a larger word limit. But for shorter articles like brief reports or opinion pieces, you might not need to include one. The instructions to authors for your article type will tell you whether you need an abstract and how to format it. So what's the typical format of an abstract? The instructions to authors will tell you whether it should be structured or unstructured. A structured abstract is one that's divided into paragraphs, and the order of information is similar to that of the main manuscript text. An unstructured abstract is a single paragraph that can present information in a more flexible order. The instructions might tell you whether acronyms or abbreviations are allowed in the abstract. Some journals allow abbreviations in the main text but don't want any in the abstract. Others, like WPSAR, allow abbreviations as long as you define them the first time, just like in the main text. For structured abstracts, many journals have specific headings that they require you to use for each paragraph. Usually these headings will be background, methods, results, and conclusions, or something similar. Finally, the instructions will give you a word limit for the abstract. Usually this will be between 200 and 350 words. The structure of your abstract will depend on your article type. Here's an example of WPSAR's instructions for a couple different article types. For our outbreak investigation reports, we require a structured abstract with a limit of 250 words, and the section headings should be objective, methods, results, and discussion. For surveillance reports, though, we just need an unstructured abstract with within 250 words. So let's talk a bit about the content that should be in your abstract. Like I mentioned, it should be essentially a summary of your paper. But at minimum, you should include the main objective of your manuscript. It should include your study type, either in the objective statement or at the beginning of the methods. It should include your main result or your most important finding. And if you have space, you can include secondary results. And it should include a conclusion based on your main results. If you include secondary results, then you can also include secondary conclusions. All of this content should also be present in your main manuscript text. And as I mentioned, there's a word limit that you need to keep to, usually about 250 words. This might sound like plenty of space, but if you have a 2,000-word manuscript, that means only about 1/10 of your information will fit. So it's important to start with the most important points and then see what other details will fit. It's much easier to prepare your abstract once the entire manuscript is finished. So it's best to save it until the end of the writing process. One technique for writing your abstract is to copy and paste your text into a new document, then delete all the minor points and sentences, leaving only the major points. Of course, you will need to do some editing to make it flow smoothly from one point to the next. Make sure the key points are summarized within the word limit, and in general, try to avoid using a lot of abbreviations or acronyms. All right, now let's talk about the article title. It can be difficult to strike a balance between keeping the title brief and including enough information, so it's important to stick to only the most important information. In general, there are 3 types of titles, and I'm going to be giving an example of each on the next slide. The first is a descriptive title that gives the person, place, and time. The second includes the main result or message from your study. And the third is written in the form of a question, usually the research question that your study attempted to answer. No matter which type of title you use, at minimum, you should try to include the topic, such as the disease being studied, the study design, the year, and the location. So let's look at these examples. First, we have a descriptive title, Measles Outbreak in a Rural Village in Country Z 2018, a descriptive analysis. We can see the person, which we can assume is the population of this rural village, the place, Country Z, and the time, 2018. We have the topic, measles, and the study design, a descriptive analysis. Second, we have a title that includes the main result of the study, Pate, the source of another Campylobacter outbreak in school cafeterias in Country Y. From this title, we can tell that this is an article about an outbreak investigation. The main result was that Pate was the source of the outbreak. Again, we have the topic, which is the pathogen name. We can infer the study design and outbreak investigation, and the location, schools in Country Y. Third, here's a title that's in the form of a question. Is the influenza sentinel surveillance system adequate? Findings from an evaluation in Country X. This title tells us the study's research question and lets us know that the purpose of this article is to present the results of an evaluation conducted to answer that question. With every manuscript submission, you'll need to include a title page. Many journals, including WPSAR, will ask that you submit your title page as a separate Word document from the manuscript file. That's because the title page includes information like you and your author's names and affiliated institutions. We don't want to send that information to peer reviewers because it might bias their reviews. So journal editors will either ask that you keep all author information out of your manuscript file, or they'll take out that information themselves before sending it to reviewers. So here I have listed what we at WPSAR specifically require in the title page file. First, there's the article title, and then a short title. Some of you might ask, well, why do we need another title? This short title is sometimes called the running head because it can be used as a page header for when articles are formatted for printing or as a PDF. So if you think of a book, you open up to a random page, and to know what chapter you're in, you look at the header at the top, and there's the chapter title running along the top of the page. The article title in full is often too long to fit on one line at the top of the page like that. So journals will often ask for a short title that will fit. And sometimes they put a limit of between 50 and 100 characters and spaces. Next, we ask for a brief description of the article within 50 words. For articles that don't need an abstract, we put this description instead of the abstract on the article's webpage. Other journals might put this description in their table of contents when they print issues. Next, we ask for up to 7 keywords. If you've ever done a search for articles on PubMed or Google Scholar, you'll know how important keywords are for finding articles on a specific topic. When coming up with keywords, imagine you are a researcher trying to find articles on that topic. What terms would you use to find your article? It's generally a good practice to use keywords that are not in your title. That's because your article is already going to be searchable by words in the title. So it's best to choose other keywords that are still related to your topic. One great source for identifying good keywords is the MESH database, which stands for Medical Subject Headings. It's this hierarchy of vocabulary that's used by PubMed and other databases to index and search for articles. Some journals will even specifically ask that you only use keywords that are listed in MESH. Next, we need the full names of all the authors and their institutions. One of the authors has to be designated the corresponding author, and for that person, we'll need an email address. This person's email will appear on the published article, so readers and researchers can contact them with questions. Finally, you can optionally provide the names and email addresses of 2 suggested peer reviewers. Please remember that we may decide not to use the reviewers that you suggest, but making suggestions helps us to identify new peer reviewers to use in the future. A lot of other journals will ask you to list your suggested reviewers in the cover letter, so I'll talk more about it when we get there. The next topic is authorship. Now, ultimately, it is up to the authors to decide among themselves who is included as an author, but there are guidelines that should be followed to avoid issues of scientific integrity and to give everyone the credit they deserve. The most commonly followed authorship guidelines are from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE. According to ICMJE, people who qualify to be authors are those who meet all 3 of these criteria. 1, contribute substantially to the study conception and design, acquisition of data, or analysis and interpretation of data. 2, draft the article or revise it critically for important intellectual content. And 3, approve the final version of the article to be published. Anyone who helped with the study but does not meet all 3 of these criteria should be listed in the Acknowledgements section, which we'll cover shortly. To prove that all authors meet the ICMJE criteria, some journals require you to describe each author's involvement in the study in a specific author contributions section. Sometimes this is included in the title page, and sometimes you tick checkboxes beneath each author's name in the submission website. When you must write the author contributions, they could look something like this, and notice that the author's initials are given instead of their full names. AA and BB designed the study. AA, CC, and DD collected and managed the data. EE conducted the data analysis. AA wrote the manuscript with support from BB, CC, DD, and EE. All authors approved the final version to be published. So we can see that we have 5 authors in total. The first 2 designed the study, while the other 3 participated in either data collection or analysis, so that will fulfill criteria 1. 1 author drafted the manuscript while everyone else participated in revisions, so there's criteria 2. And lastly, all 5 approved the final version, so that's criteria 3. There are also other contributions that you can list together with these, such as caring for patients, obtaining funding, providing materials for experiments, and supervising the study. As I mentioned, anyone who helped with the study but does not meet the authorship criteria should be thanked for their contribution in the acknowledgements section. This might include technical assistant staff, colleagues who provided advice for your study, surveillance staff, study participants, and/or other members of the investigation team. It's best to get permission from these people if you're going to acknowledge them by name. Though this isn't going to be necessary for groups of people who are not named one by one, like study participants or members of a team or group. Next is the funding source. If you received any funding to help you conduct the study or write the manuscript, you must declare it. This includes project funding, grants, funding for the organization if relevant, and funding for individual authors such as scholarships. If you didn't receive any funding, you can write none or not applicable or this study received no funding. It's best to include the section even if you have nothing to declare, so the editors know that you didn't just forget to include this section. If you're not sure whether you need to declare a source of funding, first check the instructions to authors, and if you're still not sure, declare it just in case, and the journal editors can let you know if it's not necessary. Next, you'll need to declare any conflicts of interest for all authors, or COI for short. There are many different types of COI, such as financial, institutional, research, or personal conflicts. ICMJE defines COI as when an author or author's institution, reviewer, or editor has financial or personal relationships that inappropriately influence, bias his or her actions. Journals require you to declare COI so we can evaluate for any potential bias. Now, it's important to remember that declaring a conflict of interest does not necessarily mean that your manuscript is going to be rejected. COI are printed together with the article so that readers can keep them in mind while they're reading. If you're not sure whether something is a conflict of interest, it's best to declare it. You can also email the journal and ask us to provide feedback on your individual case. Okay, let's move on to the next component, the cover letter. This is your opportunity to sell your article to the journal editors by briefly describing the article and why it should be published. Do not just copy and paste your abstract. That does not leave a very good impression on us. The cover letter is traditionally addressed to the editor-in-chief. You can find their name on the journal's website. Briefly introduce and outline the article, then argue its relevance and novelty to the research field. This means describing what is already known about the topic and then what your article adds to the topic. Finally, you need to justify its fit to the journal, meaning how it fits the journal's scope and why it would be interesting to the journal's readers. The cover letter can also be the place to suggest people to peer review your paper. So if it's not specifically supposed to be somewhere else, like the title page, it can be here instead. Here's what you should know about suggesting reviewers. Ideally, they should be experienced in your manuscript's field so they can provide valuable feedback. They can be from anywhere in the world, and I actually will intentionally choose reviewers from multiple countries to review the same paper so that we can get different perspectives. The reviewers you suggest should not be someone who would likely have a bias either for or against publishing your article. For example, they should not be your personal friends or colleagues, and they should also not be people involved in research that's competing against yours, because they might not want your article published before theirs. They should also not be people who are already editors or staff of the journal. Journal websites will have a list of the names of people on their editorial board. These are editors, not reviewers. I've seen a lot of authors get confused when they're asked to suggest reviewers because they think they need to choose from this list of names. There is no list. You need to go out onto the internet and discover people who can give you a fair and insightful review of your manuscript. Finally, you'll need to check if your journal requires any forms to be signed and submitted along with your manuscript. Most journals, including WPSAR, will ask you to sign some sort of a license for publishing. This gives us permission to publish your article. It ensures that you are the sole authors with ownership of the work. It contains a declaration that the work has not been previously published, and all authors must sign it. This form also gives international copyright protection, meaning it's plagiarism if anyone copies your article text in their work without giving credit to your article. Side note, this will include you, the authors. You cannot reuse chunks of your text in future manuscripts without citing the original text. Even though you originally wrote it, once it's published, it's considered plagiarism to copy it word for word. Some journals require that you include this license for publishing form in order for your initial submission to be considered complete, while other journals require that you just submit the form when the article is accepted or before it's published. All right, now you have all the sections written out and you have all the files you need. Here are some things to do right before you hit that submit button. Double check that your manuscript is within the scope of the journal you're submitting to. Check that you've completely followed the instructions to authors for your journal, and do a final proofread and make sure you have all the components of your submission package. It may seem like extra work to adapt your article to each journal's specific format and style, but doing so will ensure that your article is a good fit for the journal, and it will ensure a higher chance of success. I'll leave you with some resources to help you through the writing and submission processes. First, we have the Guide for Preparing Manuscripts for Publication by the American Psychological Association. This is a guide for new authors, and although it's mainly geared towards submissions to psychology journals, it covers many of the same topics that we covered today and last week, but in much more detail. Next, there's Journal Guide, which is a journal search tool that can help you find journals that match your manuscript's topic. You can search by titles, keywords, or categories. There's also JANE Biosemantics, which stands for Journal Author Name Estimator. This is also a tool to help you find journals to submit to, but you copy and paste your title or abstract into a field, and it will list journals for you based on the key terms in your text. Your best resource for tailoring your manuscript to your target journal will be that journal's own webpage. You'll find most of the information you need in the instructions to authors, but if the journal's open access, you can also check the content and format of recently published articles. Finally, don't forget to ask for advice from your co-authors, your colleagues, FETP graduates, and anyone else you know who has successfully published articles. And that concludes the presentation. So, all right, let's see how we're doing on questions.
Great job, Ashley. So we only had one question so far, which was, can people get a printout or like a PDF version of the presentation? And they're recording the entire video with the presentation in it, and also Ashley's wonderful explanations. So that will be uploaded to TEPHINET's YouTube channel, and you can consult that. You can see all the slides here and also hear the explanations, and then of course share with your friends and colleagues. And then also, not to put her on the spot, but we have Bernie with us here. She was a recently published author with the TEPHINET supplement. So if you'd like, I can share that information. She was in a panel discussing her experiences. So good to see you, Bernie. And it's good to see our FETPs getting published.
It is. Let's see, we have one new question in the Q&A. Your advice on choosing a manuscript format, e.g. report or letter or lessons from the field. Well, the advice is going to be a little different depending on the content of your manuscript. Generally, if you have a journal in mind, it's best to look at recent publications in that article type to see if the content and the format kind of match your idea for what you want your manuscript to express. So if it's a report on an actual study or analysis that you did, then you'll want more of a original research or brief report or surveillance report, that type of format. But if your manuscript doesn't include anything that's original research and you're perhaps just compiling literature sources to express an opinion, then maybe a letter to the editor or a perspective piece, for example, from WPSAR might be a better shot, might be a better choice.
I'm just going to add to that. So thanks, Peter. Great question. And Ashley, well done in answering it. I did just want to sort of, I guess, pull out and talk a little bit more about field epidemiology and deciding on article types for the work that we do in field epidemiology, because often it is a little bit different and not quite obviously a research paper. I really like the lessons from the field type of article for field epidemiology projects. WPSAR has that as an article type. The WHO Bulletin has it as an article type. And the whole idea with that type of article is to basically put forward a problem and then explain how you solved it. So for field epidemiology, it's a really nice way to talk about what you did in the field to solve whatever problem that you had. I think with other types of field epidemiology projects, surveillance reports that we do, evaluations, it is kind of, I guess, useful to look for article types that target that kind of research. So again, like Ashley said, it really depends on what your message is and the best way to get that message across. I've just seen another question pop up, which is, what is the best way to go about a rejection that isn't fully justified or that you don't agree with? Ashley, did you want to have a go at that one?
Sure. Well, you can, if you're pretty convinced that that you think that your rejection was not for a good reason, or that perhaps the editors didn't understand something, you're always welcome to email the journal editors and ask for a further explanation. I know that sometimes you will get a rejection email that doesn't explain in depth really the reasons for it. And in that case, you can definitely email the editors and ask, can you give a more detailed explanation? But depending on how busy the journal is, sometimes you might not be able to expect an answer, or at least one that that is satisfactory.
And also you could come next week. We're going to have 2 more webinars specifically focused on peer reviewing. So that seems like a good segue into our next week, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. We do have our 3rd webinar in the series of 4 next week. It's called Addressing Reviewer Feedback on Your Manuscript. And then the 4th webinar, the week after that, will be on how to be a good peer reviewer. So I will take this opportunity now to say thank you all for tuning in and listening until the end. And we hope to see you in our next webinar next week, same time, same place.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye. I'll let you know when the recording's ready.
Great. Thanks, Nancy.
You're welcome.